Okay, so I'm sitting here talking to Catriona Mitchell, who is a freelance literary events programmer and producer and works in Australia, Indonesia and India. Catriona, can you just tell me a little bit about the sort of festivals that you work on?
Sure, I work for the Melbourne International Film Festival, which I've done for the last 6 years. I programmed the Ubud Readers and Writers Festival here in Bali in 2008, and I work every year for the Jaipur Literature Festival in Rajasthan, as well as the Hay Festival in Kerala, which is a new enterprise in India.
And what exactly do you do in terms of these festivals? What's your role?
I like a bit of variety, and I do different roles within the festivals. In Melbourne, I run an event that's about adapting books for the screen. So I'm bringing publishers and literary agents together with film producers from around Australia and further afield to exchange material that they feel would be good for feature films. In Bali, I was programming the festival, so I really put together the entire international program. In Jaipur, I take Australian authors on tour to the festival. I also sometimes do research projects into Indian writers for the Australian festivals, and then I advise the Australian festivals about which Indian writers to invite. And I also do some of the presentation on the main stage for the Jaipur Literature Festival, which is a terrific amount of fun.
What are the sort of differences between all these? There's obviously three very different events with different flavours, different feelings.
Sure.
What sort
well,
of,
I do really love the Asian festivals because they're less commercially driven, or they don't have so much government funding, I guess, which gives the programmers an enormous freedom, because really they can do whatever they like with the program, provided the private sponsors are happy, and the private sponsors don't tend to have the same kind of agendas that governments do in terms of who might appear at the festivals. So that, it allows for much more creative and kind of inspiring programming, as far as I can see.
Right. The whole festival, being involved within these sort of gatherings with a whole bunch of people that come together, what for you, why have you chosen to do that? You spend quite a lot of your time working on various festivals, so why have you chosen to be involved in that sort of
on a personal level, because of the adrenaline rush, which is really, something you can become very addicted to. But really what festivals do, I think they're a celebration of human achievement and human potential, and the best that people can produce in their particular field. So when you get a large number of people from different parts of the world coming together to showcase their work, it's just an incredibly celebratory way of coming together. It's a real shot in the arm for days at a time when that happens. And it involves so many people within the community where that festival is based as well. So for me, one of the things I love about working in festivals is the interaction with so many different kinds of people, from the artists to the caterers to the security people and the audiences. There's so many different personalities who come in to work together to bring something like this off. And it's very magical when the audiences sort of go through the journey of the festival together. It creates a bond between people that I think is quite rare in other aspects of life. It's quite hard to find. We live such fragmented lives. We sit behind computer screens, we watch television in the evenings. I think societies are getting ever more isolated, even though we're more connected through technology. Festivals have that real human element of coming together in joy and celebration.
And are there any particular standout moments that spring to mind when you think about your work over the years?
I think, so for me, when festivals bring people together through a commonality, when it crosses cultural divides and any other kind of divides that are normally in play in daily life, that's very special. And I think that can happen. It happens largely through sport in the world, but it also happens a lot through music and dance. It happens through food, and somewhat to a lesser extent because of language issues, it happens through the exchange of writing and ideas and film.
Do you think, though, there's been a sort of, particularly in the literary festival front, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, I don't know if it's quite the same for, say, film festivals, but there's been this explosion. You have festivals all over the world. There's even one in Somalia, in Pakistan, in kind of just, it's almost like the new fashion, really, to sort of stage a literary festival.
For sure. And not just literary. In Melbourne, I looked at the calendar once, we tried to changed the dates for the Melbourne Writers' Festival when I was working there, and there was only one weekend in the entire year when there wasn't a festival happening in Melbourne.
So you get all sorts.
Yeah, all sorts. Food and wine, comedy, film, all sorts of sort of fringe theatre festivals. Really, whatever you can think of as a festival for.
So if you were going to do other work or work on other things, what sort of what other genres would you look at?
I'm very interested in environmental issues, having particularly spent so much time in India now, where I feel that the problems that the world is heading towards are much more visible in India than in many other places because, for example, we don't have proper waste disposal systems in many parts of India, so you see the rubbish accumulating in the streets. I've seen villages built on mountains of rubbish. That's just one example. So for me to combine a celebration of creativity and imagination, which is what arts festivals do, with an environmental focus could be a very exciting direction to move in. A friend of mine in Paris set up a water festival. So he does all sorts of performance events around water, and scientists and environmentalists come and talk. So it's not just talking heads, it's not too dry and academic. There's a very celebratory aspect to it as well. But I think the combination of those things probably has potential to be very dynamic.
And if you were to arrange anything, have you got particular places in the world that you'd like to take it, or ways you'd want to do it? Or
Festivals without borders.
Everywhere that you want to go. Now, are you involved or beginning to be involved with the discussions about a new African
Yeah, I'm
film
really
festival?
just advising a woman from Angola who lives in Melbourne and has done since she arrived as an asylum seeker as a child. She's inspired to bring an African film festival together because in recent years there's been a great influx of people from various African countries and largely Sudan into Melbourne. And there's really no public representation of those people at all. So she's trying to address that issue. There's a really fantastic cinema in Melbourne. It's called the Australian Centre for the Moving Image, which the local government has put a huge amount of money into, and it's created a state-of-the-art series of cinemas with interactive studios where you can really learn about filmmaking behind the scenes and so on. So she's going to base it there. It's a very prominent place in Melbourne, one of the focal points, in fact. And she is about to go to Africa to go and source the films that she wants to bring out for later in the year for the first edition of the festival.
Very exciting.
Yeah.
And there's that interesting thing of I went to a festival in Korea where there was a very active, it was an Afro-Asian literature festival, and the Korean government was very keen to foster links with writers from those various regions. Do things like that, or other festivals that you work with, or the stuff that you do with Jaipur with Australian writers, or taking Australian writers to India or whatever, is that part of the focus of that, creating some sort of bridge that also is beneficial in other ways?
Yeah. So last year I was on a residency from an organisation in Australia called Asia Link, which works precisely to do that. It's established to connect Australian artists and arts management people with organisations around Asia, and sends people from Australia for up to 12 weeks to work with these organisations, precisely to foster those cultural relations. And the Australian tours that I do to the Jaipur Festival are funded by Australian bodies for that purpose. And later this year I'm going to be taking 3 Australian and 3 Indian authors around India by train. Will they produce writing all along the way, and that again is funded by Australian organisations who are keen to build on and improve relations with India in cultural ways as well as business ways.
Right. And do you think there are African links that can be made in that way as well, or is that not something the Australian government is particularly focused on right now?
I know there's a huge thrust towards South Korea and India at the moment from the Australian government. Particularly this year, it's the year of Australian-Indian relations. So that's the focus for 2012. And of course it always has an economic aspect to it. So I don't know, and I haven't explored in any depth what the agenda might be with Africa, but I could find out.
Good. Okay. Thank you very much for
Pleasure.
talking to me. Thanks.